Hey everybody, Francis Buckley here, the Gandalf of audio, back for another exciting episode of How Stuff Works. This time, I thought I would tackle that most misunderstood processor, the dynamics processor. All right, now, first of all, what are dynamics processors? Well, a little game I like to play called Simplified Thinking. Simplified Thinking asks, can I rearrange the words of the sentence? Right? What do dynamics processors do? They process dynamics. It's exactly what they do. That sentence makes sense, right? What are dynamics? Dynamics is volume in music, right? That's volume. So a dynamics processor is going to have some effect on the volume of whatever you happen to run through it. There are two types of dynamics processors, two basic types that we use, right? One is the compressor limiters, and the other is expanders, the upward and downward expanders. I'll leave the expanders for another time. This time, we will conquer the compressors and limiters. Right? Let's talk about how the device works, because that's really, this is what this show is called, How It Works, right? So first of all, let's start with how the device works. These are what are called threshold dependent devices, which means they do whatever it is that you, the user, set them to do when the level of your sound crosses the threshold. Right? Now, the threshold is just a point on a scale between silence and full volume. So if I take the threshold and I set the threshold way down towards silence, that means as the sound comes up, almost everything will be above threshold because the threshold is set way down. If I set the threshold way high, like up close to zero, then the sound has to rise quite a ways, in fact, almost all the way up to zero, before it will start the device doing whatever it is that you set it to do. All right. So that's the first part, the threshold dependent, right? But there are also volume dependent devices, right? Meaning the device is going to have a difference on what goes into the device as to what comes out of it. Right. So let's go over the basic parameters of your basic compressor limiter. Okay. Number one, threshold. Right. Threshold is where the device starts to work. Now, in the case of a compressor limiter, as long as the sound is below threshold, the device will do nothing. We're just passing through the compressor. Right. But as soon as we cross threshold, the device is going to work. Right. Now, how heavily it works on the sound once it crosses threshold is what delineates compressor from a limiter. More about that in a minute. So the first three that I'm going to give you are shared by both the compressor limiters and the expanders. Right? So the first one was threshold. They're both threshold devices, right? Where the device starts to work. The next two are attack and release, right? And attack and release are the speed of the processor. Right. When I think of attack, I think of speed, somebody, So you want to be able to control it. You want to be able to have it clamp down on the sound very quickly or slowly clamp down on it to do whatever it is that you want to do with the sound. The other one is release, right? So if this one is how quickly or how slowly does it clamp down, release is how quickly or how slowly does it let go. Okay, so the common parameters, threshold, where the device starts to work, and attack and release, that's the speed of the processor. Right? Now, the next one is the big one that's kind of causes a lot of confusion. That is ratio. All right. Now, ratio in terms of a compressor is expressed in a very simple mathematical equation, which is always some number to one. Right? 2 to 1, 3 to 1, 5 to 1, 9 to 1, 10 to 1, 20 to 1, 50 to 1, 100 to 1, infinity to 1. It's always a 1, right? And what the mathematical equation is telling us is the first number represents the number of dB that you need to increase on the input, right? In order to create a 1 dB change on the output. So it's always some number to 1. So let us say we have a ratio of 5 to 1. right? So I have 5 dB coming in and I have 5 dB going out. As long as I'm down below, as long as I'm not going over 5 dB, I'm good, right? I want to raise the volume on the output to 6 dB. Okay? I want to raise it 1 dB on the output. Well, in order to raise it to 1 dB, I have to go up to 10 dB on the input, because remember, it's 5 to 1, right? So it takes 10 dB on the input to make a 1 dB change on the output. So what we are doing is we are taking a large amount of sound and putting it into the device, putting it through kind of like a funnel, if you will, and squeezing it down so only so much of it will come out, right? So that's ratio, right? So threshold, that's where the device starts to work. Attack and release, that's the speed at which the device is going to work. Ratio, that's how much work the device is going to do, right? And then the last one is output or makeup gain, because the idea is I want to restrict the amount of volume coming out of the compressor. So I may have put, at 5 to 1, I may put 13 dB into it, right? So I'm losing 3 dB in the compression process. So the output, which is the very last thing on the compressor, the output allows me to give back that 3 dB that I took away. Okay? So here's an example, putting it all together. The threshold, as long as the sound is down below threshold, the device is going to do nothing. Once it crosses threshold, the device starts to work. The speed at which it pushes it back down to threshold is the attack, right? The speed that allows the compressor to stop compressing once it drops down below threshold is the release, right? And then the ratio is, I think of ratio in terms of the sound is rising up. The threshold is the ceiling. So with compression, we have a soft ceiling that's going to allow the sound to, then the ceiling is going to go, no, back down you go, stay underneath, right? It's going to push it up, no, I'm going to push you back down. As we raise the ratio, we go to 2 to 1, 3 to 1, 4 to 1, 5 to 1, 6, or whatever it is you go to. The ceiling gets harder and harder until you get into that realm of limiting, right? And then it's like, bonk, you ain't going any louder than that. No matter how loud you turn up that input, you're not going to get any louder than that, right? Now, the only controversy that happens, if you will, in this is the point at which compression stops and limiting begins, right? What is the difference between compression and limiting? It's very simple. The ratio. Low ratio is compression. High ratio, limiting, right? Consider the word limiting for a minute, right? What is a limiter in just terms of a word? What is a limiter? Well, it's something that's going to put a limit on something. Well, that's what these are. And limit is a hard word. It's going to say, nope, that's it. That's your limit. You're done. Right? So we have a sound where the kick and snare are way up here, right? And all the rest of the stuff, the hi-hat and whatnot, are down here, right? And I would like to hear more of this stuff, right? But if I turn this up, the kick and snare go up with it, right? So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get to the point where I can raise this up without this going up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a compressor across it, right? And I'm going to set my threshold down closer to where this lower stuff is happening on the meter, right? So let's say my snare drum and kick are going up to, -1, right? And the rest of the stuff is down here about -5 or -6, right? So I'm going to put a threshold that's going to get to work about maybe -3 or -4. So you still get the idea that the kick and snare are a little louder than everything else. So what happens is when the thing kicks in, the kick and snare want to go this high, but I put this ceiling. So they're stopping right here, right? So now what I wanted to do in the first place was raise this up, right? So now that I got this close to here, now I can use that output or makeup gain and raise it up. And now I can hear this, and I still got this at the volume I had it at before. Okay? So the main thing with these things, right, is you have to use them, right? And I don't mean you got to use them on every mix. No, you have to use them. You got to play around with them. You have to learn to understand what they do, because there's a bunch of different ones, right? I'm not the technician, man. I know how this stuff works. I don't know how to build it, right? But I certainly know how it works, right? But there are different types of compressors and limiters out there. There are VCA, there are optical, there are variable mu. There's all kinds of different ones that do different things, and it's all based on how they control the difference between the volume coming in to the amount of volume that will be allowed to go out. Right. So you have to train your ears. So what I suggest, here's your homework. What I suggest, you get out your favorite track, whatever, something you know really well, bring it up in whatever your session, whatever your DAW of choice. Open up the session, bring up something like a vocal, put a limiter across the vocal, and just literally go crazy with that compressor limiter until you hear it doing this thing, and like get to the point where you go, oh wow, that's too much, right? Cool. What have you learned? You've learned how to do too much compression, right? Yeah, you got to hear what it sounds like. You'll never know what too much compression sounds like until you hear it, right? And then open another compressor and set it the same way as the compressor that you've already got, and A/B the two of them. Listen to the difference between this compressor and that compressor with the same settings. Okay. Last word on all of this stuff. We're in the digital era, right? When there was a piece of gear, especially one that was of some expense, they were expensive. And adding cool little extra things to it was always doable, but would raise the price of the product to the point where now it's more expensive than the customer is going to pay for it. But now we're in the digital world, and adding things to these standard devices, right? The dynamics processors, the frequency processors, equalizers and filters, the time-based processors, reverbs, delays, phaser flanger choruses. The ability to add extras to these things in the digital world is relatively cheap and completely easy. They don't have to build anything. They just have to code it, right? So we're starting to see exceptions to every rule of what is considered standard pieces of equipment now, because we can do these things. Even more so, the idea that you should learn how they work. And this is how dynamics processors work. They work by the sound crossing a threshold. When it crosses the threshold, in the case of a compressor or limiter, we're going to push that sound down and keep it from getting too loud, right? So we have threshold, we have attack and release. How quick is that process going to happen as the sound goes above and below threshold, right? And we have ratio. Once we cross that threshold, how much work is the thing going to do, right? And the work that it does, right? This is where it starts to work. This is how quickly it does the work. This is how much work it does. It's going to do. What is the work that dynamics processors do? The work is gain reduction, turning down the volume, right? So and lastly, we have output volume or makeup, to make up for the volume that we took away in the compression process. All right. Well, this is Francis Buckley, the Gandalf of audio, here at How Things Work. And we'll see you next time. We'll talk about expander gates. Very exciting stuff. All right, kids. See you later.